Today I am really honoured to present Simon Dyda, author of Ars Rosaria, the Rosary Art of Conjuration, which has to be one of my favourite pamphlets from Hadean's Guides to the Underworld series. Simon is a veteran British magician with many years spent as an itinerant musician, now living in Berlin. In this episode, we discuss the nature of the Rosary, its history, and the simplicities and complexities of its use in both religion and magic, as well as discussing the porous delineation of the definitions of both of these terms. We also explore Simon's interest in non-transcendental eschatology, the pagan roots of Catholicism, the modularity of grimoire practices, and one of my all-time favourite subjects, the kings of the four parts of the world. I am your host, Matt Hadfield, and it is with great pleasure that I introduce Simon Dyda to the Hadean Press podcast. Hi, Simon. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Matt. It's a pleasure to be here.
For those in our audience who aren't familiar with you and your work, could you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your experience with magic?
Well, I started in 1983 at age 10, and I started with a book called Folklore, Myths and Legends of Britain, published by Reader's Digest in 1977. I like to think of it as the Reader's Digest Necronomicon, because it's a big black cloth-bound, leather-spined book with a large horn god's head stamped in gold on the top. It's 550 pages. And it has quite a bit of lore and techniques and charms and spells from folk magic. It even has a little bit of Goetia on page 115, alongside about half a dozen spells. There are the characters of the three chiefs from Grand Grimoire, these medieval-looking cartoony faces of Lucifer, Beelzebub, and Dasturov. And it was more than enough material for a 10-year-old to be getting on with. At the same time, I was getting into mythology, learning, well, back then it was Greek and Norse mythology, learning the stories and the family trees and who was related to whom and who got on with whom. And then by 84, I was going out into the surrounding countryside. Home back then was an RAF air base in Norfolk. So I was going out and looking for secluded locations and transposing the mythic onto locations and objects in order to attempt to forge relationships with spirits. Another way of putting it is that I was using make-believe with magical intent to talk to gods. Then in the summer of 86, we moved to my mother's home turf, which is the Isle of Anglesey. Which has more cromlechs and standing stones per square mile than anywhere else, and also better libraries than rural Norfolk, where I could read up on books on occultism. But the book that had the biggest impact for me, practically, was an abridged edition of The Golden Bough, particularly the section on sympathetic magic, because that gave me all the magical theory I needed to try my hand at improvisation, which would come in handy because I spent most of the 90s and half of the noughties as an itinerant musician. So when it came to magic, I had to rely on whatever was at hand. And as an itinerant musician, naturally, song became part of my practice, song and incantation and use of a voice. And that's essentially the magic that is me.
And when did you first encounter marzipan then?
Well, marzipan, that's an in joke to do with a Google search I made, where there were more Google search result hits for ceremonial marzipan than there were for ceremonial magician.
Nice. Looking at your actual pamphlet, which we're going to talk about today, which is titled Ars Rosaria, the Rosary Art of Conjuration, and reading from the blurb at the back, it reads, "Rosary beads are more commonly considered a devotional tool than a magical one. Yet, From a magician's perspective, they are unambiguously both, and can be used as a ward against evil as well as a means of ensuring that wishes will be granted. In this guide to the underworld, rosary beads are used in combination with adaptations of the Holy Rosary, a Marian exorcism, and various Goetic conjurations to conjure and form pacts with the demons of Goetia. So let's unpack this a little. Could you describe how a rosary is more commonly utilized and how a magician may adapt this to their own practice and purposes?
Okay, well, the common use is, well, it's the most, I think, the most popular devotion in Catholicism, and the popular use involves the rosary has these sets of 10 beads grouped together called decades, and there are 5 decades. And as you are reciting the Hail Marys of each decade, you're visualizing a scene from Christian mythology, stuff that Mary witnessed or experienced, mostly to do with the life of Christ. And they're called mysteries, these scenes. I think it's because they're also connected with each mystery is connected with certain religious virtues that you're supposed to be contemplating. And there are in total 15 mysteries, which adds up to 150 Hail Marys, which is supposed to correspond to the 150 Psalms. So a monk would recite 150 Psalms in a week. So this is kind of a layman's devotional equivalent of doing that. In terms of magical adaptation, well, to begin with, they are kind of magical to start off with because you have this thing called the promises of a rosary. And these are 15 promises that were revealed by the Virgin Mary to a 15th century Breton cleric called Alain de la Roche. And what they amount to is divine assistance, divine protection of body, mind, and soul, a fast track through purgatory, eternal life, an unperishable soul, theosis for those that are interested in that kind of thing. But I think more interestingly for magicians is one promise, which is, "You shall obtain all that you ask of me by the recitation of the rosary." So when people are reciting the rosary, they can also be basically praying for something that they want. But it also has this element of being the chant, the recitation of the chant, which has its own magical value. And so you can adapt incantations that you want. If you have an incantation, you can adapt it to the rosary and make it a chant, or create your own incantation and use it with the rosary.
They are intrinsically magical, I think, but perhaps you wouldn't necessarily hear that from a Catholic.
Maybe not so much from a Catholic priest, but I mean, Catholicism is full of magic, but they just don't call it magic. They call it asking God for stuff. Uh,
Sanctioned magic, maybe, or
yeah, it's a sanctioned magic, which is why they don't call it magic, I suppose. Uh, Especially you have this thing where basically magic, or magic. If we define magic, you have Ronald Hutton's definition, which is techniques to bring about material change by uncanny means at the will of the performer. And what we have here is techniques to bring about material change by divine intervention, i.e., God, at the petition of the performer. And only God can grant these things. But you can go to a saint or an angel, and he will put in a good word for you. And if you ask God for something, or Jesus/God, he can say no. And if an angel or a saint puts in a good word for you, he can still say no. But he can't say no to Mary because Mary is his mum. And the Ten Commandments dictate that he has to do what his mother tells him, basically. So that's part of why the cult of Mary is so popular and the rosary is so popular, because it's kind of, he can't say no to his mum.
I'd never thought of it that way. That's really fascinating. So, could you explain a little bit more about theosis?
Oh, well, Theosis isn't my bag. I'm more into non-transcendental eschatology, but if you're into theosis, which I suppose many Christians are, it's if you're doing the rosary and you're a devout and yeah, a devout Catholic doing all the devout stuff, then yeah, you can get theosis through reciting the rosary. That's one of the promises. Not exactly in those words, but it amounts to theosis.
And how would you define it?
Becoming one with God.
So as opposed to apotheosis.
Oh, you got me there. What is
Yeah.
apotheosis?
Like becoming God, maybe.
Uh, yeah, you don't become God, but you more or less, well, I suppose you become part of God.
Okay, it's a new word for me. So theosis. I like it. Interesting. I imagine that rosaries then have, as you mentioned, they have a long tradition in magical adjacent use in folk religion. Could you elaborate on that further? How would people historically use a rosary?
Well, for instance, you can use rosary for exorcisms, and this is still sanctioned by the church. This isn't exactly a folk thing. You can, for example, just by placing the beads around someone's neck, you can exorcise a demon. And the physical object of a rosary is a protective tool. You can use it to ward off evil.
Does that have something to do with it being a circular object?
I think it's to do with because Mary, one of the titles of Mary is the Empress of Hell, and that's because she nothing in hell can withstand her. So she's like a big boss character that you can use against evil.
And so then, where do you think this line is between folk religion and magical practice?
Well, I mean, folk religion is usually to do with some spirit that is, or set of spirits that are in some way unorthodox, local spirits or a local set of spirits, such as fairies, for example, or a local saint. And depending on just how unorthodox they are, they'll either be uh, included into the calendar of a local church, or be classed as a folk religion, or be classed as a superstition. But basically, any ritual in a religious context is a magical ritual. I mean, that's what they're about. Their magical rites. They might have devolved into just things that we do on certain occasions. Like if you think of in Poland, you have this custom of drowning the pagan goddess Majana, the goddess of death and winter, every spring equinox. And that's just a fun thing to do these days. But uh, most people would say, oh, well, it's symbolic of, the end of winter and the coming of spring. But it has a magical purpose, and that's to ensure that spring that's coming is a good one. For example, we've just had what would be classed as a bad one in terms that it was hot, and then it was cold, and then it was hot again, and this has ruined quite a few crops for some people. This isn't sanctioned by the Catholic Church, but all the participants are Catholics. Uh, and they make a doll, usually out of straw, I think, that represents this goddess Majana, the goddess of winter and the underworld. And they take it to a river and they drown it, send her back into the underworld. Because in Slavic mythology, the underworld is a wet place. It's a wet and marshy place. And yeah, that's today they do that just as a bit of fun to mark coming of spring.
Interesting. I've never heard of that practice before, but it has some it has some similarities with Greek myth.
Yeah, sure. It's kind of another take on the whole Persephone thing, where you think of Persephone coming back in the spring, but the Slavs they concentrate more on sending the winter goddess into the underworld.
So how would you describe your relationship then with Christianity?
Well, my approach to Christianity is as a pagan. I mean, for me, well, Christianity is a pseudo monotheistic crypto-polytheistic form of paganism. Jews have one god, Muslims have one god, Christians have two guys and a ghost, plus a Virgin Mother, plus a trickster king of hell. And that's not monotheism, that's paganism. You even have resurrection, the figure who dies and comes back, that's pagan. The theology is a fridge-raid soup of pagan theology and cosmology, often contradictory. You have all these ideas about transcendentalism, but at the same time, when you say the creed, you say, "I believe in the resurrection of the flesh," and that's kind of the opposite of transcendentalism. Also, it's Christianity is part of our heritage in Europe, at least. It's part of the dream time of Europe. Christians say, I just see no difference between Christian saints and angels and so on, and pagan gods and heroes. They're all part of the dream time.
The Dreamtime is the Aboriginal Australian concept?
Right, yeah, but kind of appropriating it for further use. I mean, the term dream time is kind of made up by anthropologists in the 19th century or early 20th century, but the Aboriginal peoples have kind of taken it on because for them, using the word dream and dreaming kind of conveys the otherworldly, supernatural nature of these concepts.
And so how do you apply this concept of Dreamtime then to Christian practice in this regard?
Well, yeah, that's to do with the use of mythology and story in relation with dreams. Well, when we're dealing with spirits, the spirits, they're kind of part of a story. You can't separate spirit from the story of a spirit and the lore of a spirit. And so this is what is meant by dream time, the term dreaming. The dreaming of a spirit isn't just a spirit, it's also the whole package, the lore and the locality and the story of the spirit. So, for example, when we're dealing with a saint or an angel, we're also dealing with the story of that saint and an angel. And when we're dealing with the spirits of Goetia, well, we're also dealing with the story of the spirits of Goetia.
So we're engaging with the mythic.
Exactly.
Okay, so and you mentioned earlier as well this idea of Marianism. Could you elaborate further on that?
Well, as I was saying before, one of the reasons why the cult of Mary is so popular is the fact that God can't say no to his mum, and that's one of the reasons why it's so popular. I mean, historically, in many cases, the cult of Mary is a continuation of previous goddess cults, depending on the locality. So you have Artemis of Ephesus and so on, the Virgin of Guadalupe, and pretty much any motherly or mother type or big goddess anywhere where Catholicism or Christianity came along would end up being syncretized with Mary. But there's also the psychological factor where for some people, they prefer to have a relationship with a mother than a father. I think Marianism is possibly I don't know, the bulk of Catholicism. I mean, it's very big.
I've never heard it framed in this way before. That is all simply just as Catholicism. So, hearing about it from this interesting, like magical perspective of like how you say, God can't say no to his own mother. So if you working through Mary to petition spirits and saints, yeah, it's just a really fascinating, novel concept to me, and I'm sure maybe to other people as well. So it's really fascinating. So thank you for taking the time to explain it. So let's move on then to this idea of Goetia that you bring up in your pamphlet. How would you describe or define Goetia in your practice?
The thing that interests me about Goetia is it's to do with spirits from the underworld. So it's to do with eschatology. I mean, I'm more interested in that aspect than in the things the spirits might bring you through pacts and so on. For me, the interest in Goetia was meeting some of these spirits in dreams rather than asking them for things.
And so eschatology is the how we deal with the afterlife.
Right, yeah. And what we think will happen after we die and where we go and so on. I mean, what drew me to my experiments with Goetia, the experiments that came about putting together the Ars Rosaria. Well, I hadn't really heard of Goetia until about, I mean, apart from the Ars Goetia, the whole concept of Goetia as a practice hadn't really crossed my path until I came into contact with Jake Stratton Kent on Facebook. And the thing that drew me to Jake was the fact that he was an itinerant magician. I hadn't read any of his stuff until I befriended him on Facebook. So he got me interested in Goetia. And yeah, this I was already interested in the underworld and dreams. For me, dreams dreams aren't a private sandbox. They're an entranceway to the underworld and to underworld realms. Um, if you think of someone walking down the street, you have an external reality, the street and where the person is going. But at the same time, they have their internal reality. They might be in their thoughts in a completely different place and time, having a conversation with someone who isn't there. But there's generally no problem, but there's this internal reality and an external reality. The division's quite clear normally. But in dream, you don't have this clear division. So you might be in a dream meeting spirits and meeting dead people and meeting other dreamers. And at the same time, seeing stuff that has to do with your own internal life and psychology and so on.
Yes, I was just reading in True to Earth by Cadmus, and he writes in one chapter about the spectrum between life and death, and how wakefulness is to sleep what sleep is to death, and how there are no hard barriers delineating these regions. And ultimately, what I'm saying is there's this porous nature to dream, which allows for that communication to occur. So, for instance, we tend to speak to spirits more, or we tend to speak to the dead more often in our dreams.
Well, yeah, I mean, for me, that's kind of what I've experienced. You know, going back to 1991, it was in the middle of 1991. I wasn't yet a busker, but I was a vagabond. And as I was hitchhiking up and down Britain, on several occasions between destinations, I had to sleep rough. And while I was sleeping rough, I would enter this state between being awake and being asleep, where I would be conversing with local spirits. And then because this happened on several occasions in a short space of time, a few months, by the October of that year, I had become what I call an active dreamer rather than a passive dreamer. And this led gradually over maybe 20 years into the point where I realized, I was actually meeting dead people in my dreams and also spirits. If I engaged with, say, the Ars Rosaria, I was meeting spirits from the Goetia in dream. But yeah, for me, this connection with dream and death is very real. I've met people I know who have passed on in dreams shortly after they've passed on. Uh, Not so much in the long run. Like I meet them shortly afterwards, and then until now, never again.
So yeah, that's really interesting to hear your experience of Goetia, and yeah, very similar to the sort of approach that Jake Stratton Kent was taking with this idea of eschatology and um, exploring the underworld, dream, meeting the dead. Yeah, so this is really interesting stuff. But yes, in your introduction in the pamphlet, you write that the reader should treat this pamphlet as an experimental supplement to the grimoires, rather than a standalone grimoire in its own right. I really enjoy this, and it's something that's totally up my Ali, because it's this idea of like using these modular concepts or supplementary materials, and you offer it so well in this pamphlet and lay it out really well. Um, like it could be used by anyone in relation to any practical exploration of the grimoires. Could you describe something of how you developed this approach and why you wanted to put it into print?
Okay, so I mean, I wasn't really writing for newcomers to magic. I didn't see the point in writing a whole grimoire because we already have grimoires, and grimoires about Goetia. And I think that's why, the introduction, the preparation is as brief as possible, really, because I wasn't. Oh, it was just there for the safety of newcomers, but I wasn't really writing for newcomers. So that's why it's modular. Um, why I wrote it? Well, it began in its early stages as a blog post. I think this from Hadean Press suggested, why don't I write a pamphlet? I wasn't too keen on writing a pamphlet at the time, but then Jake was encouraging me always to write something for Hadean Press, and eventually I thought, okay, I'll turn this into a pamphlet, but it needs more work. So I worked on it more, and uh, the result is the Ars Rosaria.
So you also write that as a visually impaired magician, I construct my magic circle using voice and direction alone. So as someone who is both really fascinated by the nature of the magical voice and with the manner in which adaptations can be created within the tradition, I'd really love to hear more about this. Like adaptation to circumstances, it's a really important aspect of magical practice, and like disability shouldn't ever be an impediment to the evolution of our practice.
Well, as far as I can see, there are generally speaking three three general modes of conjuration in Goetian Solomonic magic. You can have no circle, or you can have a circle, or you can have a circle in a triangle. And when you have a circle in a triangle, like in the Ask Goetia, you're in your circle and you want one demon to appear in the triangle. So it's a question of a kind of a question of territory. And then when you have just the circle, you're in a circle, and you're kind of handing over all the territory outside the circle to the spirits. So in some instances, they turn up as a whole host. Whereas if you have no circle, there's no transfer of territory. You're sharing the space with the spirits, and so depending on exactly what location you're using, uh, that will determine the dynamic of what's going to happen. But yeah, with a voice and directions, well, you're still creating the liminal space through the use of voice and the use of direction. The thing with the rosary is because it has these 5 decades, sets of 10 beads. If you start in one decade facing the north, when you come to the fifth decade, you return to the north. So you've completed a whole circle. So yeah, that's a vocal circle, so to speak, but it's not a physical circle. There's no kind of territorial demarcation. But yeah, when it comes to disability, I mean, I've been losing my eyesight gradually over time over the past 20 years. So I've just had to adapt to my circumstances. My eyesight is still the way my brain is wired. It's still my prime sense, even though it's failing. So I'm not going to use a circle if I can't see the circle or read the words in a circle. There's just no point to it. That's why no circle. But I do write that, because it's modular, you can use whatever circles in your grimoire. Still use a rosary.
And do you bring your music into this space?
Uh, no, not yet. Well, I haven't tried it with music. With music, I do stuff with music, but it's things like certain tunings. For example, you have if you think of the normally, what's the normal chord? The chords, you have A, B, C, D, E, F, G, but you also have this alternative used in countries like Spain where it's uh, what is it? It's do, re, mi, fa, sol, la,
Oh yeah.
si. And so I took the word sol, which is the G, and you have it fits with the scheme of a planetary hours with the planets. So you have Sol, the sun, and then the next one is Mars, and then the next one is Venus, and so on. And so you can tune the guitar so that it's in the chord of a certain planet. You can also do things like just pick certain songs because if you're, I mean, I project my voice when I'm a busker. I sing outside, or I used to be. I sing outside. I don't sing inside. So I'm projecting my voice. So I have to have power in my voice. And this, I think, this calls attention from the spirits. So you have to select. You can select certain songs that have a certain meaning to them to get a certain result. And then also you can do things like make a charm, on a piece of paper and stick it in your guitar while you're playing it. Things like that.
That's really cool. I love that. Thank you for sharing that. And you also utilize the Psalms a lot in this pamphlet. Do you bring any kind of musicality to the way that you work with the Psalms as well?
No, I just chant them. Just chant them in a normal voice.
Could you elaborate on the way that Psalms work into this kind of magic, into, well, specifically the grimoire magic and how you utilize them with the Rosary?
Okay, well, I mean, Psalms, I think they've always been magical incantations, some of the oldest incantations on the written record.
Yeah, they predate Christianity.
Well, I think some of them predate Judaism. Some of them are Sumerian in origin, apparently. So they're very old. The Sumerians also used Psalms. And I think they've always been used. I mean, they were used in Jewish magic and then passed on to Christian magic. Today, they're pretty essential in hoodoo. The idea, I think, is well, one of the ideas is that they kind of add juice to the spell that you're doing. In the grimoire practice, I mean, more often than not, there'll be the what is it, the seven penitential psalms. So they're part of the whole process of confession and purification. But in other grimoires, like the Book of Gold, they're spells. You pick a psalm and you add some other bits to the psalm, material and symbols and so on. They're the spell. And in hoodoo, as I said, they're kind of used to give power to the spell. In a rosary, well, the rosary, as I was saying earlier, the 150 Hail Marys of the 50 mysteries is kind of the layman's equivalent to the 150 Psalms. So if you were going to do a spell where normally you would be applying a psalm, such as in hoodoo, but say you don't have access to the psalm, or you have to do something on the fly, and you have a set of rosary beads, the rosary incantation could stand in as an alternative to using the psalm.
So, as many will know, I am a champion of the Grimorium Verum. So, I was very pleased to find that your pamphlet focuses on the way in which the rosary can be utilized with its framework. I was especially happy to see that you utilized the seals from Joseph H. Peterson's translation of The Secrets of Solomon. So, what was your reasoning for this choice of grimoire?
Um, well, it was partly timing. The book came out just as I was getting interested in Goetia. It's also the novelty of it, so to speak, because it was quote unquote brand new, to boldly go where nobody had been before recently. Uh, it was also aesthetically pleasing because it's very witchy looking. The symbols of the Goetia spirits are very witchy. Also, the connection with Venice. Was it early 1600s Venice or late 1500s? That's an interesting time. I like that connection. Also, there's no ambiguity about which characters belong to which spirits. It's uh, it's not a mixed up rehash of some other previous grimoire. Such as in the grimoire in Verum, you have various versions where they have the characters of the seals of the spirits mixed up, or they've got the wrong one here and there. And it's a lot of guesswork needed to reconstruct it. You don't have to do that with the Secrets of Solomon. It's so to speak the original uh, in that respect.
Yeah, it's much simpler.
Oh, and that was the other thing. Is that book one, which contains all the Goetia spirits, the whole book, the whole thing to me comes across as very modular. You know, these four books, they seem very modular. And so you have this book one with the Goetia spirits. It strikes me as something that you can take and adapt to something else, like the Rosary, for example. It's not explicitly stated that you have to use a circle and conjuration to call these spirits. Uh, yeah, see, it all comes across as modular to me.
Which is exactly why I brought up the idea of modularity earlier, because I think it's really impressive, it's really interesting, and um, when you're working this kind of magic, having that modularity at hand, it allows your practice to be so much more fluid, and it allows it to evolve more naturally. You know, it. So I was really impressed by it. I really enjoyed that aspect of your pamphlet, and I think a lot of other people who are listening might also find it interesting and find it quite beneficial to their own practice. So you mentioned then earlier about the way in which you use the rosary itself to find the north, and we talked a little bit about direction, but what is it specifically about the north in your work that, or in this specific kind of magic, which is so important?
Ah, well, this is mostly to do with the Secrets of Solomon, because in book one of the Secrets of Solomon, you have Lucifer as Lord of Europe and Asia, Beelzebub as Lord of Africa, and Elistor as Lord of America. And for me, this isn't about continents, it's about directions. So you have Lucifer in the north, Lucifer in the east, Beelzebub in the south, and Elistor in the east. And I think this has to do with the stations of the sun. So the sun rises in the northeast, east, and southeast, depending on the time of year. Well, that's kind of Asia from a European perspective. So the sun reaches its apex in the south, so Africa, uh, and it sets, depending on the time of year, in the southwest, west, or northwestern America. And then it's never in the north. And so the north represents the sun in the underworld. And this is why Lucifer is both Lord of the North, as Emperor of the Underworld, and also Lord of the East. So there was that factor. And also, I think on page 66 in book two, uh, when you're creating the circle, and this is a circle to conjure the intelligences of book two. It's not explicitly about conjuring Goetia spirits from book one. But they they refer to directions and north, south, east, west, and so on. But before they do that, they use the term the four parts of the world. And for me, that's kind of coincides with this use of four continents rather than directions. And then on page 84 of book two, when it comes to conjuring, saying the incantations to summon these intelligences, you start facing the north. That's in the book. So those are some reasons for using the north. The other reason was that as I was trying out these experiments in creating Ars Rosaria, I just found things ran smoother facing north than facing any other direction. And it also coincides with my home practice when I'm doing my daily venerations and so on and offerings to spirits. I find that having them in the north so that I'm facing north works better. I think it coincides actually with home altars in Shinto, where you have the spirits facing the south or facing the east. So they're facing the direction of the sun, not you.
Yeah.
And it's this whole idea in the West, we tend to think of, are we facing a direction where we should be thinking, are the idols facing that direction? So even when you think of people who have a number of figures on an altar, and they'll have certain figures on the left and certain figures on the right, but from the perspective of the spirits, it's the other way around. The ones on the left are actually on the right. So maybe we should be thinking from their perspective rather than ours.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So stepping out from the anthropocentric conceptualization of why we're doing this and start focusing instead on the spirit world or the spirit aspect of this. Yeah, that's really, really great point. Um, Continuing with this idea of cardinality and directions, to what degree do the four kings play a part in this kind of magic, and how can they be engaged with via the rosary?
Well, the four kings are in there because partly because of the writing of Jake, who brings up the four kings a lot, and they're not. I don't think they're in the grimoire in Verum, are they?
No, they're not.
And they're not in the Secrets of Solomon, so they're kind of missing, so to speak. So I thought I'd put them in, but I think of them as well. When you have these four kings plus the three chiefs, you have the number seven, and that's kind of a number for completeness, so to speak. You know, the seven planets uh, and the seven spirits of planets, and as Jake said in many images, probably wrote, these seven spirits predate astrology, and so you have these three chiefs that represent the stations of the sun, and then you have 4 points of the compass, or the four winds, if you like. I think of them as four winds, the four kings. So they're there so that you have the number seven, you have this completeness. But as for engaging with them, they're there, they're there so that you can give them due respect. But I don't know about actually engaging with them, because they don't come across as, very safe to use spirits.
Yes, they are often described as dangerous and unclean, but they also make up a they also are incredibly important in necromancy and yeah, generally just with many of the grimoires. Many grimoire operations begin with you conjuring the four kings or at least one of them. But yeah, so it's really fascinating the way that you've incorporated them into this system.
Yeah, so it's about showing them respect, so that they won't do bad things to you.
Is there any specific kind of advice that you would give to somebody who is interested in working this into their magic?
Well, I do the rosary daily, and it's part of my ancestral practice. Because I have Catholic heritage, um, me, it's pleasing to my immediate ancestors that I use the rosary. And I do it at sunset. And there's an interesting link between the rosary and planetary hours. Whereas, because traditionally, if you're doing a daily rosary, you do the joyful mysteries on Mondays and Thursdays, and the sorrowful mysteries on Tuesdays and Fridays, and the glorious mysteries on Wednesdays and Saturdays. And if you're doing that at the hour of sunset, you're doing it in the hour of joyful mysteries in the hours of Venus and Luna, the sorrowful mysteries in the hours of Saturn and Mars, and the glorious mysteries in the hours of Sol and Mercury, which kind of fits the theme of those mysteries. And apart from that, you could, and there's also all the benefits of the promises of a rosary. So you're not only venerating your ancestors, you're getting the benefits, the magical benefits, protection, and so on, divine assistance and protection. And apart from that, you could also use the rosary in connection with planetary hours. So remembering that scheme I just mentioned, if you have a Venusian spell to do, do one of the joyful mysteries do the joyful mysteries in the hour of Venus or Luna, and so on. Other things you can do with the rosary is, as I mentioned before, is you can adapt existing incantations to the rosary so that they turn into a chant, or you can create your own incantations and fit them to the rosary. I have various incantations I've made to do with non-Christian entities, pagan gods, but doing it to the scheme of a rosary. So yeah, there's plenty of things to work with there.
Yeah, it's almost infinitely practical and adaptable.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, well, thank you so much for your time today, Simon. I guess the final question I have for you is there anything that you're particularly obsessed with, or are there any projects that you're working on at the moment?
Right. So well, which one first? I am writing a book that will come out through Hadean Press. Uh, I don't really want to say too much about it, except that it will pretty much have almost everything useful I have to impart from my experience. Uh, so it won't be a big book. I like to be succinct. Obsessions. I think my main obsession is question non-transcendental eschatology. I think if there was a Venn diagram of my obsession, it'd be one circle would be eschatology, the other circle would be dreams, and the third circle would be the concept of eternal recurrence. So yeah, that's the kind of stuff I'm into.
Cyclic time?
Right, yeah, cyclic time.
Yeah. That's really fascinating. We'll have to put a pin in those amazing concepts, and in the future, I'll have to have you back on and we can talk about those further. They sound really interesting.
Sure, that would be great.
All right, and well, thank you so much for coming on to the show today, Simon. It's been a real pleasure to finally get to talk to you properly and hear about all these ideas. And yeah, I've had a really good time. Thank you for coming on, and I'm looking forward to speaking to you again in the future.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks for having me. It's been a real pleasure to be here.
That was Simon Dyda, author of Ars Rosaria, the Rosary Art of Conjuration, which is available now from Hadean Press's Guides to the Underworld. Link in the description. Despite the apparent simplicity of Simon's text, I think we touched on a great number of really complex ideas and concepts which I would really enjoy discussing further with him in the future. I adored his description of magic as transposing the mythic onto locations and objects in an attempt to forge relationships with spirits, to the point that I think this might be my new favourite definition of our practice. It doesn't imply transaction, but instead a deep and meaningful relationship, something which is all but lost in modern contexts. Simon develops this concept further when he says that he prefers to meet spirits in dream over simply asking them for things, and that dreams themselves aren't a private sandbox, but instead an entranceway into the underworld. I am really pleased that there are magicians and sorcerers in the world who are developing these authentic modalities of practice and inviting us to join them, and I truly look forward to reading more from Simon in the future. Please hit the like button and share our videos with those who might find our work interesting. I'm really excited to continue spotlighting Hadean authors in this, our second year, and I can confirm already that we have some amazing guests already lined up and ready for the months to come, myself included. So thank you all so much for your support, and I will see you all again in the next one.